Do you hear that? That's the sound of absolute isolation. When you're hauling 80,000 pounds of steel and cargo down a pitch black stretch of highway at 3 in the morning, your mind starts to play tricks on you. You start seeing shapes in the shadows. You start hearing whispers in the static of your CB radio. Most people roll up their windows, lock their doors, and tell themselves it's just the fatigue setting in. But out here, on the forgotten back roads of America, sometimes the shadows are real. Sometimes what you see in the headlights doesn't vanish in the rearview mirror. Welcome back to Channel 19 Mysteries. I'm your host, The Midnight Rider, broadcasting to you from the dark side of the dial. Tonight, we are journeying deep into the mist-choked peaks of the Appalachian Mountains, into a place the locals and veteran gear jammers simply call the Forbidden Zone. Before we cross that yellow line into the unknown, be sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like to keep our headlights burning bright. And if you've ever seen something out on the open road that you just can't explain, pull over and drop a comment down below. Now, let's get into tonight's story. A trucker's Appalachian nightmare. To understand the sheer, unadulterated terror of what happened to a veteran commercial truck driver named Tommy Vance, you first have to understand the unique culture of long-haul freight driving. In the trucking industry, there is a universal, unspoken rule. Money dictates the route. Commercial drivers are independent contractors or hardened company men who get paid by the mile and by the load. They routinely brave black ice in the Rocky Mountains, blinding dust storms in the deserts of the American Southwest, and the exhaust-choked bumper-to-bumper chaos of major metropolitan arteries. They do this because they have mortgages to pay, families to feed, and diesel tanks to fill. For the right price, a seasoned driver will haul absolutely anything, absolutely anywhere. But there is one glaring, terrifying exception to this rule. Nestled deep within the ancient, crumbling peaks of the eastern United States lies a geographic anomaly known to locals and veteran haulers as the Cumberland Plateau. Specifically, there is a jagged, lightless expanse of tertiary highways and forgotten county roads that weave through the mist-choked gaps of the Appalachian Mountains. To the uninitiated, it is simply a scenic, albeit dangerous, rural shortcut. But to the men and women who drive 18-wheelers for a living, this specific stretch of geography is known simply as the Forbidden Zone. In truck stops from Ohio to Georgia, you will hear hushed, paranoid conversations over stale coffee about this region. You will hear stories of men who have driven for 40 years, men who fear neither God nor nature, who will outright abandon high-paying, desperate loads rather than cross those lightless switchbacks after the sun dips below the tree line. They will pull their massive rigs onto the shoulder, lock the doors, draw the sleeper curtains, and wait for dawn, willingly taking a financial penalty rather than driving through the Appalachian night. Because what happens on those mist-choked gaps defies all logical explanation. The accounts that bleed out from the Forbidden Zone do not speak of mere mechanical breakdowns or treacherous weather. They speak of a predatory hunger. They speak of an ancient asphalt that seems to possess a conscious, malevolent desire to consume the unwary. This brings us to the chilling case of Tommy Vance. Thomas, known to his friends as Tommy, was not a superstitious man. As of October 29th, 2015, Tommy had been driving heavy freight for exactly 22 years. He was a broad-shouldered, pragmatic man with calloused hands and a mind built entirely around mechanical logic. He understood diesel engines, air brakes, and the laws of physics. He did not believe in ghosts, he did not believe in curses, and he certainly did not believe in Appalachian folklore. But on that late October afternoon, Tommy was facing a problem that pragmatism could not solve. He was staring down a mountain of medical debt. His wife, Sarah, had recently undergone a series of expensive surgeries, and their insurance had flatly refused to cover the rehabilitation. Tommy was thousands of dollars in the hole, and the bank was threatening to foreclose on their modest home in Knoxville, Tennessee. He was desperate. Tommy was sitting in the dispatch office of a regional logistics company, a grim, fluorescent-lit room smelling of ozone and cheap ink. Behind the reinforced glass sat Jack Bennett, a dispatcher, known for handing out the routes that nobody else wanted. Jack was a thin, nervous man who constantly chewed on the end of a plastic pen. He knew Tommy was hurting for cash. Jack slid a heavily stamped manifest across the counter. "I have a specialized load, Tommy," Jack said, his voice dropping to a low murmur. "It's an expedited delivery of industrial generator parts. They need to be at a mining facility deep in the Kentucky basin by tomorrow morning. The catch is the route." Tommy picked up the manifest. The payout printed at the bottom of the page made his eyes widen. It was triple the standard rate. It was enough money to clear his wife's medical debt in a single stroke and leave enough over to save his house. "What's the route, Jack?" Tommy asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in his chest. Jack hesitated. He tapped a bony finger on a map spread across his desk. "The main interstate is completely shut down due to a massive rock slide near the border. The highway patrol says it won't be cleared for 3 days. The only way to get this load to the facility by tomorrow morning is to cut directly through the Cumberland Plateau. You have to take State Route 116. A heavy silence fell over the small dispatch office. State Route 116 was the very artery of the Forbidden Zone. It was an infamous, decaying, 2-lane road that wound its way up into the highest, most isolated peaks of the Appalachian Range before plunging down through a series of hairpin switchbacks that had claimed countless lives. There were no streetlights, no cellular service, and no shoulders. On one side of the road was solid, jagged rock. On the other was a sheer drop into a seemingly bottomless, tree-filled abyss. "You want me to take a fully loaded rig up 116? Tommy asked, narrowing his eyes. "At night?" "I know the stories, Tommy," Jack said defensively, rubbing his temples. "I know what the guys say about the plateau. But I also know you need this money. The client is desperate. They are willing to pay an exorbitant premium because 4 other drivers have already rejected the load today. They flat out refuse to drive that stretch after dark. I'm offering it to you because I know you don't buy into those ghost stories." Tommy stared at the astronomical dollar figure on the manifest. He thought about the foreclosure notices sitting on his kitchen counter. He thought about his wife's worried face. He took a pen from the counter and signed the manifest with a hard, decisive flourish. "Hook the trailer up," Tommy said. "I'll leave within the hour." By 6 o'clock that evening, Tommy had completed his pre-trip inspection. He was driving a customized 1999 Peterbilt 389, a massive, powerful machine that Tommy maintained with religious devotion. The engine purred with a deep, rhythmic perfection. The massive trailer behind him was sealed and incredibly heavy, weighing in at nearly 80,000 pounds. As Tommy pulled out of the dispatch yard, the sky above the Tennessee hills was already bruising into a deep, dark purple. The weather forecast had predicted unseasonably low temperatures and dense fog moving into the higher elevations. Before making the final ascent into the plateau, Tommy pulled his rig into the Crossroads Diner, a dilapidated, neon-lit truck stop that served as the last outpost of civilization before Route 116 began its treacherous climb. Tommy just wanted a large black coffee to keep him sharp for the harrowing drive ahead. The diner was mostly empty, save for a few weary travelers and a solitary, weathered old man sitting at the counter. As Tommy sat down and ordered his coffee, the old man slowly turned to look at him. The man's face was a map of deep wrinkles, and his eyes were milky with cataracts. His name was Silas Creed, a local fixture who had driven coal trucks through the mountains for 40 years before retiring. Silas looked out the greasy window, his milky eyes fixing on Tommy's massive Peterbilt idling in the parking lot. "You ain't hauling that load up 116 tonight, are you, son?" Silas asked. His voice was like grinding stones, raspy and hollow. "That's the plan," Tommy replied politely, taking a sip of his scalding coffee. "Got a rush delivery. Interstate's closed." Silas slowly shook his head, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped a ceramic mug. "There's a reason them boys pay triple to run that road in the dark, and it ain't because of the curves. You don't go up into the plateau after the sun goes down. The mountains, they get hungry." Tommy forced a polite smile. "I'm a careful driver, sir. I've got good brakes and bright lights. I don't believe in the boogeyman." Silas didn't smile back. He leaned in closer, and Tommy noticed with a slight chill, that Silas was missing the ring and pinky fingers on his left hand. "You think it's just stories?" Silas whispered. "You think it's just tired drivers seeing shadows? Let me tell you about Jacob Miller." Jacob was a good boy. Best gear jammer I ever saw. On November 12th, 1988, Jacob took a load of timber up, 116. It was a night just like tonight. Fog, thick as pea soup. Jacob was talking to me on the CB radio. He was about halfway up the summit, right where the switchbacks get tightest. Silas paused, his clouded eyes staring at something only he could see. Jacob came over the radio. Silas continued, his voice dropping to a terrified rasp. He was screaming. He didn't say his brakes failed. He didn't say his engine blew. He said, "Silas, there's people in the trees. They're dropping down onto the trailer." Then the radio went to dead static. The State Patrol found his rig the next morning, sitting perfectly still in the middle of the road. The engine block was cracked clean in half. It was split open like a frozen melon. But the temperature that night never dropped below 40 degrees. And Jacob? Jacob was gone. The doors were locked from the inside. The windows were rolled up. The only thing they found of Jacob Miller was his leather boots, still laced up tight, sitting perfectly placed on the floorboards under the steering wheel. Tommy felt an involuntary shiver run down his spine, but he quickly pushed it away. He was a man of logic. Jacob Miller probably abandoned his rig to escape creditors, Tommy reasoned internally. The cracked engine block was likely a catastrophic metallurgical failure. There was an explanation for everything. Tommy stood up, threw a $5 bill on the counter, and tipped his hat to Silas. "I appreciate the warning, old-timer, but I've got a schedule to keep." As Tommy walked out the door, Silas called out after him, "If your rig dies on that mountain, Thomas Vance, do not open the doors. No matter what you hear, do not open the doors." Tommy climbed into the cab of his Peterbilt, the familiar smell of diesel and worn leather acting as a comforting balm against the old man's creepy warnings. He engaged the gears, and the massive truck rumbled out of the parking lot, aiming its headlights toward the towering black silhouette of the Cumberland Plateau. For the first 45 minutes, the drive was uneventful, albeit intensely stressful. Route 116 was in horrific condition. The asphalt was crumbling at the edges, and the lanes were so narrow that Tommy's massive dual tires rode the painted lines on both sides. The incline was brutal, forcing Tommy to constantly shift through the lower gears, the engine roaring in protest as it dragged 80,000 pounds of dead weight up the mountain. As the truck climbed higher into the atmosphere, the environment began to drastically change. The temperature gauge on the dashboard plummeted with unnatural speed. It dropped from a mild 55 degrees down to 30 degrees in a matter of minutes. And then the fog rolled in. It wasn't a normal fog. It didn't drift or billow. It seemed to ooze out of the dense, ancient forests lining the road, pouring onto the asphalt like a heavy, gray liquid. Within seconds, visibility was reduced to less than 10 feet. Tommy flipped on his high beams, but the light simply hit the wall of mist and refracted back, creating a blinding, luminescent curtain. He was forced to turn his brights off and rely on his low beams, crawling along at a meager 15 miles per hour. The silence outside the cab was absolute. The deep, rumbling roar of his massive engine seemed to be swallowed instantly by the thick, unnatural mist. That was when the first mechanical anomaly occurred. Tommy's CB radio, which had been softly emitting the gentle crackle of static, suddenly erupted into a deafening, high-pitched squeal. Tommy quickly reached out and dialed down the volume, but the squeal was immediately replaced by a voice. It wasn't a trucker. It wasn't a police dispatcher. It sounded like an old, garbled radio broadcast from decades past. Through the static, Tommy could hear the faint sounds of big band music, layered over the sound of people weeping. "What the hell?" Tommy muttered, reaching over and turning the CB radio completely off. He clicked the power knob until it snapped into the off position. But the weeping continued. It was still coming through the unpowered speakers. A cold spike of adrenaline hit Tommy's heart. He stared at the darkened face of the radio. That was impossible. He checked the wiring, wondering if he had a short circuit drawing power from an auxiliary battery. But as he looked down at his dashboard, his breath hitched in his throat. The dials on his instrument cluster were going insane. The speedometer was swinging wildly from 0 to 80, despite the fact that he was crawling up a steep incline. The fuel gauge dropped to empty, then slammed over to full. And most terrifyingly, the tachometer, the gauge that measured the engine's revolutions per minute, was spinning backwards. Mechanically, an engine cannot run backwards while propelling a vehicle forward. It defies the fundamental laws of combustion and gearing. Yet, Tommy could feel the massive engine beneath him shuddering, a sickening, rhythmic grinding noise vibrating up through the floorboards. "Come on, Betsy, hold together," Tommy pleaded, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the massive steering wheel, wrestling the truck around a terrifyingly sharp switchback. To his right, the fog briefly parted, revealing a sheer, guardrail-less drop into absolute blackness. And then, without a sputter, without a warning cough, the mighty Peterbilt engine simply died. It didn't stall out. It was as if someone had reached into the engine block and severed every electrical and fuel line simultaneously. The deafening roar of the diesel engine vanished, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating silence. The power steering instantly failed, turning the steering wheel into unmovable concrete. The air brakes locked up with a violent hiss, throwing Tommy hard against his seatbelt as the 80,000-pound rig ground to a violent, shuddering halt right in the middle of the pitch-black, mist-choked mountain pass. All the lights on the truck, the headlights, the cab lights, the running lights winked out in perfect unison. Tommy was plunged into absolute, impenetrable darkness. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. He frantically twisted the ignition key. Nothing. Not even a click from the starter. He hit the dashboard. He flipped every auxiliary switch. Dead. The entire electrical system was fried. Tommy sat in the terrifying silence, his heavy breathing the only sound in the cab. The temperature inside the truck began to plummet rapidly. He could see his own breath pluming in the dark. He reached for his cell phone, his hands trembling. He turned it on, the bright glow of the screen hurting his adjusted eyes. No service. Not a single bar. He was trapped. He was utterly alone, miles from civilization, sitting in a dead, unpowered metal box in the heart of the Forbidden Zone. The warnings of Jack Bennett and the old man, Silas Creed, echoed mockingly in his head. The mountains, they get hungry. Tommy reached under his seat and pulled out a heavy, steel, Maglite flashlight. He clicked it on, the powerful beam cutting through the darkness of the cab. He needed to get out and check under the hood. He needed to see if a main battery cable had snapped or if an alternator had catastrophically failed. It was the only logical explanation. He unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for the heavy metal door handle. But just as his fingers brushed the cold steel of the latch, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a soft, distinct tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the passenger side window. Tommy froze. His heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slowly, agonizingly turned his head toward the passenger door. He pointed the heavy metal flashlight toward the glass and clicked the button. The bright beam illuminated the passenger window. And staring back at him, pressed flat against the glass, was a face. It was a woman. Or at least, it used to be. Her skin was the color of old, dirty parchment, pulled tight over sharp, skeletal cheekbones. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely black, devoid of any white. She was wearing a faded, mud-stained dress that looked like it belonged in the 1930s. But the most terrifying aspect was not her horrifying appearance. It was her physical location. The passenger window of a Peterbilt 389 is almost 9 feet off the ground. There was no step there. There was no platform. For this woman to be looking directly into his window, she would have to be hovering in thin air, suspended over the sheer drop of the mountain gorge. The woman did not blink. She slowly raised a pale, rotting hand and tapped a single long fingernail against the thick glass. Tap. Tommy let out a strangled gasp, scrambling backward, pressing his back against his own door. His mind, built entirely on pragmatism and mechanics, violently rejected what his eyes were seeing. This was impossible. This was a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaust fumes. It had to be. He squeezed his eyes shut. "It's not real. It's not real," he chanted in a frantic whisper. When he opened his eyes, the window was empty. The face was gone. Tommy let out a ragged breath, slumping forward over the steering wheel. He was losing his mind. He just needed to calm down. But then, the truck violently lurched. It wasn't a gentle sway from the wind. It was a massive, violent heave, as if something incredibly heavy had just landed on the roof of his cab. The heavy metal roof visibly buckled downward with a sickening metallic groan. Then came the sounds of heavy, dragging footsteps moving across the roof of the sleeper berth. Tommy was paralyzed. He aimed his flashlight up at the padded ceiling of the cab. He could see the fabric depressing, tracing the path of whatever was walking above him. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before. Tommy waited, his finger trembling on the flashlight button. Nothing happened. Then, out of the darkness of the sleeper berth area behind his seat, a voice whispered directly into his right ear. "Open the door, Tommy." It was a wet, gurgling whisper, smelling of damp earth and rotting leaves. Tommy screamed. He whipped around, swinging the heavy mag light with all his might into the darkness of the sleeper compartment. The flashlight hit nothing but the air mattress. The sleeper berth was completely empty, but the assault on the truck had just begun. From outside, a cacophony of horrific noises erupted. It sounded like dozens of hands slapping wildly against the aluminum sides of the trailer. Screeches of tearing metal echoed through the mountain pass as invisible claws raked down the sides of the 80,000-pound rig. The entire truck began to rock violently from side to side, the heavy suspension groaning in protest. They were trying to flip the truck. They were trying to push it over the edge of the cliff into the black abyss below. Tommy scrambled into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel in a blind panic. He frantically twisted the ignition key over and over again. Click, click, click. Nothing. The truck remained dead, a helpless steel coffin being battered by an unseen, malevolent force. Silas Creed's terrifying words flashed through his mind. Do not open the doors. No matter what you hear, do not open the doors. Suddenly, the violent rocking stopped. The scratching ceased. The oppressive silence slammed back down on the mountain. Tommy sat perfectly still, hyperventilating, tears streaming down his face. He kept the flashlight trained on the windshield, waiting for the next attack. Through the thick, swirling mist, illuminated by the faint moonlight, Tommy saw shadows moving onto the road ahead of him. They were tall, impossibly thin figures, their limbs too long and disjointed. They were emerging from the dense woods surrounding the front of his truck. There were dozens of them. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, slowly forming a blockade across the narrow asphalt. They began to walk toward the hood of his Peterbilt. Tommy knew, with absolute, horrifying certainty, that if those things breached the cab, he would become just like Jacob Miller. He would simply vanish, leaving only his boots behind. He looked down at the ignition. He looked at the fuel gauge, which was still inexplicably reading empty. He closed his eyes and thought of his wife, Sarah. He thought of his impending foreclosure. He thought of the sheer injustice of dying on this forsaken mountain for a paycheck. A profound, furious anger suddenly overpowered his terror. He was Thomas Vance. He had driven over 2 million miles without a preventable accident. He was not going to die in a broken down truck in the middle of nowhere. Tommy grabbed the ignition key. He didn't just turn it, he gripped it with both hands and twisted it forward with a violent, desperate force, letting out a primal scream of absolute rage. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, deep within the frozen bowels of the engine block, a spark ignited. The massive Cat diesel engine coughed. It sputtered. And then, with an earth-shattering, thunderous roar, the engine violently exploded back to life. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. The headlights, high beams and fog lights, instantly blazed into existence, projecting twin beams of blinding, incandescent light through the mist. The blast of light illuminated the figures, standing directly in front of his grill. For a fraction of a second, Tommy saw them clearly. They were not human. They were towering, faceless entities, composed of what looked like twisting, rotting roots and pale, dead flesh. They recoiled violently from the sudden blast of the headlights, throwing their impossibly long arms over where their faces should have been. Tommy didn't hesitate. He didn't wait to build air pressure for his brakes. He jammed the heavy gear shifter violently into first gear, popped the clutch, and slammed his heavy steel-toed boot down on the accelerator pedal, burying it into the floorboard. The massive Peterbilt roared, the rear dual tires spinning wildly on the damp asphalt, screaming and smoking as they desperately fought for traction. The massive rig lurched forward, an 80,000-pound battering ram of steel and diesel power. Tommy drove directly through the blockade of entities. He didn't feel an impact. He didn't feel the thud of bodies hitting the heavy metal bumper. Instead, as the truck tore through them, the cab was suddenly filled with a horrific, deafening shriek that sounded like tearing metal and burning hair. A cloud of thick, black smoke plumed up from the grill, obscuring his vision for a terrifying second. Tommy violently shifted into second gear, then third, ignoring the dangerous incline and the hairpin curves. He was driving entirely on adrenaline and pure instinct. He took the switchbacks at speeds that should have flipped the heavy trailer, the massive tires riding the very edge of the deadly cliffs, sending showers of loose gravel plummeting down into the abyss. He did not look in his rearview mirrors. He refused to look anywhere but straight ahead. He drove like a madman for nearly 2 hours, the powerful engine screaming as he threw the rig down the backside of the Cumberland Plateau. The thick, suffocating mist finally began to break, giving way to the clear, cold night air of the Kentucky Basin. The oppressive, unnatural feeling of the forbidden zone suddenly vanished, as if he had pierced through an invisible barrier. Tommy finally allowed himself to breathe. He coasted the truck down onto a wider, well-maintained 4-lane highway, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles ached. His entire body was shaking uncontrollably. He had survived. He had escaped the mountain. By the time the sun began to rise on October 30th, 2015, casting a pale, weak light over the rural Kentucky landscape, Tommy had arrived at the coordinates listed on the dispatcher's manifest. But as he pulled his massive rig up to the address, his exhausted mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. There was no industrial mining facility. There were no workers, no loading docks, and no heavy machinery. The address belonged to a massive, overgrown, chain-link fenced lot. In the center of the lot stood the charred, crumbling foundation of a massive warehouse that looked like it had burned to the ground decades ago. Weeds as tall as a man grew through the cracked concrete. Nature had entirely reclaimed the property. Tommy put the truck in park, his engine idling softly in the cool morning air. He stared at the desolate ruins. He picked up the heavy, stamped manifest Jack Bennett had given him. The address was completely correct, down to the zip code. He picked up his cell phone. Now, back in civilization, he had full service. He dialed the number for his dispatch office in Tennessee. The phone rang 3 times before an unfamiliar female voice answered. "Highland Logistics, how can I help you?" "Yeah, this is Tommy Vance," Tommy said, his voice raspy and exhausted. "I need to speak to Jack Bennett in dispatch. I'm at the delivery site and there's a serious problem. The facility isn't here." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The clicking of a computer keyboard could be heard. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance," the woman said, sounding genuinely confused. "I don't show in Jack Bennett working in our dispatch department. In fact, looking at the employee directory, we haven't had a Jack Bennett employed here since 1999. And according to your log, you were listed as taking personal leave starting yesterday. You aren't assigned to any loads." Tommy felt the blood drain from his face. A cold, heavy knot formed in his stomach. He looked down at the manifest in his hand. The ink, which had been dark and fresh the night before, now looked faded and incredibly old. "There must be a mistake," Tommy stammered. "I picked up an expedited load of generator parts last night. It's in trailer number 8422. "Mr. Vance, trailer 8422 was decommissioned and sold for scrap 3 years ago," the dispatcher said gently, clearly thinking she was speaking to a man having a mental breakdown. "Where are you exactly?" Tommy slowly hung up the phone. He didn't answer her. He sat in the cab of his Peterbilt, staring at the burned-out ruins of the facility. He climbed out of the truck, his legs shaking beneath him. He walked around to the back of the massive trailer. The heavy padlocks he had secured the night before were still intact. He grabbed a heavy set of bolt cutters from his storage box and snapped the locks off. He threw open the heavy swinging doors. The trailer was completely, entirely empty. There were no generator parts. There was no freight. There was just 53 feet of echoing, empty wooden floorboards. Tommy stumbled backward, leaning against the cold metal of his truck. He had risked his life. He had driven through a living nightmare, stalked by things that defied human understanding, hauling an empty trailer to a destination that hadn't existed for 20 years, dispatched by a man who didn't work for the company. He began to laugh. It was a broken, hysterical sound that echoed across the empty, overgrown lot. It was the laugh of a man whose reality had just been permanently, fundamentally fractured. Tommy Vance quit driving that very morning. He unhitched the empty trailer, left it sitting in the overgrown lot of the burned-down facility, and bobtailed his truck back to Tennessee, taking the long, flat interstates. He never drove a commercial rig again. He sold his beloved Peterbilt a month later and took a job working the parts counter at a local auto supply store in Knoxville. But here is the detail of Tommy Vance's story that continues to terrify the trucking community to this day. The detail that proves that the Forbidden Zone operates on a terrifying logic entirely its own. 2 days after he returned home, absolutely convinced he had suffered a stress-induced psychotic break, and bracing himself for the total financial ruin of losing his home, Tommy opened his banking app to check his dismal balance. On the morning of November 1st, 2015, a wire transfer had cleared into his account. The origin of the transfer was completely blank. It was untraceable, but the amount deposited was the exact, to the penny, exorbitant sum promised by Jack Bennett on that faded, impossible manifest. It was exactly enough to pay off his wife's medical debt, save his house, and leave enough left over to start a new life away from the asphalt. Tommy Vance took the money. He paid his debts, but he never, ever drove near the Cumberland Plateau again. He knows the truth now. He knows that the asphalt stretching through those mist-choked gaps doesn't just harbor ghosts. It is a place of ancient, predatory transactions. It is a place that will feed on your terror, push your sanity to the absolute breaking point, and if you somehow manage to survive the night and make the delivery, it will pay its debts in full. Well, drivers, that's one haul I think we're all glad we weren't on. The Cumberland Plateau hides its secrets in the fog, but as Tommy Vance learned, the Forbidden Zone always honors its contracts, one way or another. Would you have risked the drive for that kind of payout? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into the unknown, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Channel 19 Mysteries so you never miss a dispatch in the dark. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. Do you have your own brush with the unexplained? Whether it's a strange highway encounter, a glitch in reality, or something lurking deep in the woods, I want to hear about it. Send your stories and creepy encounters to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com, and your experience might just be featured in a future video. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road, check your mirrors, and whatever you do, stay safe out there.